April 16th, 1945. Somewhere over the North Sea, 17 miles east of the Frisian Islands. Second Lieutenant William Lawley's B-17 Flying Fortress shuddered violently as German flak tore through the No. 3 engine. Metal fragments peppered the fuselage with sounds like hail on a tin roof. The smell of burning oil and hydraulic fluid filled the cockpit, acrid and choking. Through the plexiglass nose cone ahead, he could see the rest of his formation continuing toward Bremen, their contrails stretching white against the pale morning sky. Lawley was 23 years old. He had flown exactly 11 combat missions over occupied Europe. His crew called him lucky because they had made it through the worst of the winter bombing campaign without losing a single man. They believed in him with the kind of faith that young men in war give to leaders who seem blessed by fortune. But fortune had nothing to do with what was about to happen. The order came through his headset with the kind of mechanical clarity that left no room for interpretation. All damaged aircraft were to abort the mission and return to base immediately. Stragglers attracted German fighters like wounded animals drew wolves. The group commander's voice was firm, final, and rooted in the hard mathematics of survival. A damaged bomber slowed the formation, created gaps in the defensive box, and endangered every other aircraft trying to maintain tight spacing. Lawley acknowledged the order. His co-pilot, Lieutenant James Murphy, was already calculating their heading back to England. The navigator was plotting the shortest route home that would keep them over water and away from known flak concentrations. Everything in their training, everything in the regulations, everything in the accumulated wisdom of Bomber Command pointed toward one conclusion: turn around, get out, live to fly another day. Then the intercom crackled again. This time it was Staff Sergeant Henry Mason, the ball turret gunner, his voice tight with something that wasn't quite fear, but wasn't far from it. "Lieutenant, we've got a problem back here." The ball turret. That plexiglass and steel sphere suspended beneath the belly of the aircraft, where a man curled into a fetal position, surrounded by machine guns and 500 rounds of ammunition, completely sealed off from the rest of the crew. The most isolated, most exposed, most psychologically difficult position on any bomber in the European theater. Mason's turret had taken damage from the same flak burst that destroyed the engine. The hydraulic system that rotated the turret and opened its doors had failed completely. The mechanical backup had jammed. Mason was trapped in a sphere that could neither turn nor open, hanging beneath 8,000 pounds of aircraft, 17,000 feet above the North Sea in April. Lawley felt his hands tighten on the control column. The mathematics of the situation arranged themselves in his mind with terrible clarity. If they bailed out over the North Sea, Mason would die. You cannot bail out of a ball turret. The parachute is stowed in the fuselage above. The only way out is through doors that open inward from the outside. Without those doors, the ball turret becomes a coffin made of plexiglass and aluminum attached to an aircraft that would sink in less than 30 seconds once it hit the water. Their only chance to save Mason was to make it back to England, land the damaged bomber, and cut him out on the ground. But the nearest friendly airfield was 90 minutes away across hostile territory. 90 minutes flying alone, away from the protective formation, with a dead engine and damaged controls. 90 minutes during which every German fighter pilot in the region would know exactly where to find them. Murphy's voice came through the intercom, steady but weighted with the implications they both understood. "Bill, if we break formation, we're a target. If we try to make it home alone, we probably won't make it. If we go down over land, we're prisoners if we're lucky. If we go down over water—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The regulations were clear. In situations where a crew member was trapped and could not be extracted in flight, the pilot's primary duty was to the majority of the crew. 8 other men aboard this aircraft could bail out and survive. Staying with the damaged bomber to save one man meant risking 9 lives for one. Lawley had been trained to make decisions based on numbers, on probabilities, on the cold logic of resource allocation.
The Air Force had spent months teaching him to compartmentalize, to see combat as a series of tactical problems with solutions that could be calculated and executed. They had prepared him for engine failures, for flak damage, for fighter attacks, for navigation errors, for equipment malfunctions. They had not prepared him for this. From his position in the ball turret, Mason could see nothing except empty sky and ocean. He did not know they were damaged. He did not know the rest of the crew could escape while he could not. He did not know that his pilot was sitting in the cockpit, feeling the weight of a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long or short that life might be. The bomber continued flying east, away from England, away from safety, toward Bremen, where German fighters were already scrambling to intercept the formation they had just left behind. Every second of hesitation was a second of fuel burned, a second of altitude lost, a second closer to a decision that could not be unmade. Murphy's voice came through the intercom, steady but weighted with the implications they both understood. "Bill, if we break formation, we're a target. If we try to make it home alone, we probably won't make it. If we go down over land, we're prisoners if we're lucky. If we go down over water—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The regulations were clear. In situations where a crew member was trapped and could not be extracted in flight, the pilot's primary duty was to the majority of the crew. 8 other men aboard this aircraft could bail out and survive. Staying with the damaged bomber to save one man meant risking 9 lives for one. Lawley had been trained to make decisions based on numbers, on probabilities, on the cold logic of resource allocation. The Air Force had spent months teaching him to compartmentalize, to see combat as a series of tactical problems with solutions that could be calculated and executed. They had prepared him for engine failures, for flak damage, for fighter attacks, for navigation errors, for equipment malfunctions. They had not prepared him for this. From his position in the ball turret, Mason could see nothing except empty sky and ocean. He did not know they were damaged. He did not know the rest of the crew could escape while he could not. He did not know that his pilot was sitting in the cockpit, feeling the weight of a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long or short that life might be. The bomber continued flying east, away from England, away from safety, toward Bremen, where German fighters were already scrambling to intercept the formation they had just left behind. Every second of hesitation was a second of fuel burned, a second of altitude lost, a second closer to a decision that could not be unmade. Murphy's voice came through the intercom, steady but weighted with the implications they both understood. "Bill, if we break formation, we're a target. If we try to make it home alone, we probably won't make it. If we go down over land, we're prisoners if we're lucky. If we go down over water—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The regulations were clear. In situations where a crew member was trapped and could not be extracted in flight, the pilot's primary duty was to the majority of the crew. 8 other men aboard this aircraft could bail out and survive. Staying with the damaged bomber to save one man meant risking 9 lives for one. Lawley had been trained to make decisions based on numbers, on probabilities, on the cold logic of resource allocation. The Air Force had spent months teaching him to compartmentalize, to see combat as a series of tactical problems with solutions that could be calculated and executed. They had prepared him for engine failures, for flak damage, for fighter attacks, for navigation errors, for equipment malfunctions. They had not prepared him for this. From his position in the ball turret, Mason could see nothing except empty sky and ocean. He did not know they were damaged. He did not know the rest of the crew could escape while he could not. He did not know that his pilot was sitting in the cockpit, feeling the weight of a choice that would define the rest of his life, however long or short that life might be. The bomber continued flying east, away from England, away from safety, toward Bremen, where German fighters were already scrambling to intercept the formation they had just left behind. Every second of hesitation was a second of fuel burned, a second of altitude lost, a second closer to a decision that could not be unmade. Murphy's voice came through the intercom, steady but weighted with the implications they both understood. "Bill, if we break formation, we're a target. If we try to make it home alone, we
60 miles from the English coast, the number 4 engine quit. There was no warning, no gradual deterioration. One moment it was running hot but functional, the next it ceased completely with a grinding shriek of metal on metal. The propeller windmilled uselessly for several seconds before the feathering mechanism locked it in place. The blades aligned with the airstream to reduce drag. Now they were down to 2 engines out of 4. The B-17 was designed to fly on 2 engines, but not loaded with fuel and ammunition, not with extensive structural damage, not with shot-up control surfaces that made every input mushy and delayed. The bomber began to lose altitude. Not dramatically, not in a death spiral, but with the inexorable mathematics of an aircraft that could no longer generate enough thrust to maintain level flight. Lawley pushed the throttles forward on the 2 remaining engines, coaxing every ounce of power he could, but the numbers didn't lie. They were descending at roughly 50 feet per minute. At this rate, they would be in the ocean long before they reached England. Murphy was already recalculating their options. His voice was professional, clinical, stripped of emotion because emotion would not change the physics of their situation. Bill, we're not going to make landfall. We'll hit the water in about 40 minutes if we maintain this descent rate. We need to decide now. Do we ditch while we still have the P-51s for air cover and SAR coordination, or do we try to make it closer to shore? Search and rescue. The Air Force had fast boats stationed at intervals along the coast specifically to recover downed air crews. But the North Sea in April was brutally cold. Water temperature in the low 40s. Survival time measured in minutes, not hours. Even with rescue boats nearby, ditching in the channel was a death sentence for anyone who couldn't get out of the aircraft quickly. And Mason couldn't get out at all. The awful truth of their situation crystallized with perfect, terrible clarity. If they ditched, Mason would die. The ball turret would flood in seconds once the bomber hit the water. There would be no time to cut him out, no way to pry open the jam doors before the aircraft sank. All their effort, all their sacrifice, the choice that had defined the last hour, all of it would end with Mason drowning, trapped in a steel sphere, while the rest of the crew floated in their life vests watching him disappear beneath the waves. The P-51 pilot came back on the radio, his tone no longer casual. He had been watching their descent, running the same calculations, reaching the same conclusions. B-17, we've alerted SAR and they're scrambling boats to your position. But you're going down fast. What's your situation? Lawley keyed the mic, and for the first time since the crisis began, his voice betrayed the strain. We have a crewman trapped in the ball turret. Can't extract him in flight. If we ditch, he dies. We need to make it to land. There was a brief silence. Then the fighter pilot's voice came back, softer now, understanding. Copy that, B-17. We'll do everything we can. But what could they do? The P-51s couldn't carry the bomber across the remaining distance. They couldn't restore dead engines or repair shot-up control surfaces. They could protect the B-17 from further attack, but they couldn't defeat physics. Chen's voice came through the intercom, urgent but measured. Lieutenant, I've been looking at the weight distribution. If we start throwing equipment overboard, guns, ammunition, anything we can strip out, we might be able to slow the descent rate. Buy ourselves a few more miles. It was a desperate measure and everyone aboard knew it. The bomber was already stripped down to essentials. There wasn't enough weight to jettison to make a significant difference. But Murphy immediately began coordinating the effort anyway because doing something felt better than simply watching the altimeter wind down toward zero. The crew went to work with frantic efficiency. The waist gunners pulled their .50 caliber machine guns from their mounts and pushed them out through the open gun ports. Ammunition cans followed, tumbling end over end toward the gray water below. The radio operator began stripping out non-essential equipment from his station. Every few minutes, something else went out the door: toolkits, spare parts, personal equipment, anything that had weight. The descent rate slowed. Marginally. 40 feet per minute instead of 50. It wasn't enough, but it was something. It meant they would be 500 feet higher when they reached the coast. 500 feet that might make the difference between making it to an emergency landing strip or ditching in the shallows. But Mason remained trapped below, aware of what was happening but unable to contribute. Unable to do anything except wait and trust that the men above him would find a way. His voice came through the intercom periodically, checking in, maintaining the pretense of normalcy even though everyone aboard understood the stark reality of their situation. How we doing up there, Lieutenant? We're working on it, Mason. Just hold tight. What else could he say? They were doing everything humanly possible and it wasn't enough. The ocean was rising to meet them with patient, terrible inevitability, and all their ingenuity and courage couldn't change the fundamental equation. They had chosen to save Mason, and that choice was about to be tested in the most brutal way imaginable. The coastline appeared ahead, a thin dark line separating gray water from gray sky. 20 miles out. Then 15. The bomber continued its inexorable descent. 10 miles. They were down to 800 feet now, low enough that Lawley could see individual waves, could judge the wind direction by the whitecaps streaming across the surface. 5 miles out. 400 feet. Murphy had already radioed ahead, alerting the emergency crews at the nearest airfield. But there was an airfield and then there was a suitable landing surface for a shot-up bomber with minimal control and 2 dead engines. The calculations were becoming increasingly grim. 3 miles. 200 feet. The water was close enough now that Lawley could taste salt in the air bleeding through the damaged fuselage. Mason had stopped talking. Everyone had stopped talking. The only sound was the straining roar of the 2 remaining engines and the whistle of wind through the bullet holes in the bomber's skin. 2 miles. 100 feet. They weren't going to make it. Then Chin spotted it. Emergency strip, 11 o'clock, 2 miles. I can see the markers. Lawley banked left, fighting the sluggish controls, nursing every ounce of altitude out of the dying bomber. The emergency landing strip was exactly what it sounded like. A hastily constructed runway carved out of farmland, barely long enough for a bomber, nothing but packed dirt and perforated steel planking. No control tower, no maintenance facilities, just a strip of flat ground that some engineer had decided was better than the ocean. They crossed the coastline at 75 feet, low enough that Murphy flinched as they cleared a seawall by what looked like yards rather than feet. The landing strip appeared ahead, marked by red flags along its edges, trucks already racing toward their position with emergency crews inside. Lawley called for landing gear down. Nothing happened. The hydraulic system was completely dead. Manual backup. Chin and Murphy worked the emergency cranks, their faces straining with effort as they hand-pumped the main landing gear into position. One indicator light turned green. Then another. The nose gear remained red. Nose gear won't lock. Murphy's voice was tight. We're going to hit on the mains and the nose is going to smash down. It's going to be rough. Rough was an understatement. A nose gear up landing in a damaged bomber would tear the aircraft apart. The ball turret would scrape across the steel planking, grinding Mason against the runway in a horrible parody of a landing. If the fuselage broke up during the slide, and it almost certainly would, Mason would be crushed or torn apart. But they were out of altitude, out of fuel, out of options and out of time. The end of the runway was approaching at 120 miles per hour. Lawley pulled power on the 2 remaining engines, feeling the bomber settle toward the ground. The landing strip filled his vision, steel planking rushing past below. He eased back on the control column, bleeding off speed, trying to touch down as gently as a 50,000-pound aircraft with minimal controls could manage. The main gear touched first. The tires shrieked against the steel planking. The bomber bounced once, settled again. For a single moment Lawley thought they might actually pull this off. Then the nose dropped. The impact was savage. The plexiglass nose cone shattered instantly. Metal screamed as the forward fuselage ground against the runway. The ball turret hit next, and Lawley heard Mason scream over the intercom as the turret scraped and bounced and was crushed against the runway surface. The bomber slewed violently to the left as the damaged tail section caught the wind. Something in the wing structure gave way with a sound like a rifle shot. Lawley stood on the right rudder pedal trying to counteract the slide, but the rudder was largely destroyed and the aircraft was out of control, sliding sideways down the runway at 80 miles per hour, trailing sparks and pieces of aluminum. The left wing dug into the dirt beside the steel planking and the bomber spun completely around, rotating 180 degrees before slamming to a stop in a cloud of dirt and dust. For several seconds nobody moved. The sudden silence was deafening after the roar of engines and the screaming of tortured metal. Then Lawley was on his feet, scrambling out of his seat, pushing past Murphy, heading aft toward the ball turret. The emergency crews were already converging on the bomber, bringing fire extinguishers and cutting tools, but Lawley reached the turret first. The plexiglass was shattered, ground away against the runway. Through the broken canopy, Lawley could see Mason, his flight suit torn and bloody, his face a mask of pain and shock. But his eyes were open. He was alive. Get him out. Lawley was screaming now, no longer the comm pilot but simply a man desperate to complete what he had started. Get the doors open. Get him out. The emergency crews went to work with their cutting tools, prying at the jammed turret doors, working with frantic efficiency while Mason hung suspended inside, conscious but trapped. It took 4 minutes that felt like an eternity, before the doors finally gave way and they could pull him free. Mason collapsed onto the grass beside the runway, his legs unable to support him after the hours cramped in the turret and the violence of the landing. But he was out. He was breathing. He was alive. The medics descended on him immediately, checking for injuries, stabilizing his back and neck, preparing him for transport. Lawley knelt beside him, his hands still shaking from adrenaline and relief and the weight of what they had just done. Mason looked up at him, his face twisted with pain but his eyes clear and focused. He tried to speak, couldn't, tried again. Sir. You didn't have to, the regs said. Lawley cut him off, his voice rough. Screw the regs, Henry. You're part of this crew. We don't leave crew behind. The rest of the men were climbing out of the bomber now, stumbling away from the wreckage on legs that barely functioned after the hours of tension and terror. Chin appeared beside Lawley, looking at the destroyed aircraft, at Mason being loaded onto a stretcher, at the emergency crews spraying foam on the smoking engines. Jesus Christ, Chin breathed. We actually made it. Murphy joined them, his face pale but composed. He looked at Lawley with an expression that contained too many emotions to name. Bill, you know they're going to investigate this. You broke formation. You ignored orders. You endangered the entire crew for one man. Lawley nodded slowly. He knew. He had known from the moment he made the choice. There would be questions, reports, a board of inquiry. His career was almost certainly over. He might face court-martial. The Air Force did not take kindly to officers who improvised their own regulations during combat operations. But as he watched Mason being carried toward the ambulance, still alive, still breathing, still conscious enough to give a weak thumbs up to his crewmates, Lawley discovered something surprising. He didn't care. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences flowed from his choice, he could live with them. Because he had looked at the choice between regulations and humanity, between doctrine and conscience, and he had chosen the man. He had become the person his father had hoped he would be. The kind of person who could live with himself. The formal inquiry began 3 days later in a gray office building on the edge of the air base. William Lawley sat alone at a small table facing 3 senior officers whose expressions revealed nothing. Murphy and the rest of the crew had been interviewed separately, their testimony recorded and sealed. Now it was Lawley's turn to explain why he had broken formation, ignored direct orders, and endangered 8 men to save 1. The lead investigator, a colonel with 25 years of service and ribbons from 2 wars, laid out the facts with clinical precision. Lawley had received a direct order to abort the mission and return to base. He had acknowledged that order. Then he had deliberately chosen to continue into hostile airspace, breaking formation and creating a dangerous situation that had required the diversion of fighter escort resources and emergency landing facilities. Lieutenant, I want to make sure I understand your decision-making process, the colonel said, his voice neutral but his eyes sharp. You were aware that regulations require the pilot to prioritize the safety of the majority of the crew in emergency situations. You were aware that by staying with a damaged aircraft instead of allowing the crew to bail out, you were risking 9 lives for 1. And you proceeded anyway. Is that correct? Lawley met the colonel's gaze without flinching. Yes, sir. That is correct. Can you explain your reasoning? Lawley had spent 3 days thinking about how to answer this question. He could cite exceptional circumstances, could argue that the presence of the P-51 escort changed the risk calculation, could claim that his assessment of the bomber's airworthiness made return to base feasible. All of these things were technically true. But they weren't the reason. Sir, Sergeant Mason couldn't bail out. If we had abandoned the aircraft, he would have died. I couldn't give an order that would kill one of my crew members when there was any possibility of bringing him home alive. The colonel's expression didn't change. Lieutenant, pilots give orders that result in crew deaths regularly. That's the nature of combat operations. Sometimes the tactical situation requires sacrifice. Your training covered this extensively. Yes, sir. It did. Then why didn't you follow that training? Lawley was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was steady but thoughtful, as if he was still working through the answer himself. Sir, the training taught me to make decisions based on probability and tactics. To calculate risks and optimize outcomes. To see the crew as resources to be managed rather than individuals to be protected. He paused, choosing his words carefully. But Mason wasn't a resource, sir. He was a 20-year-old kid from Ohio who trusted me to bring him home. They all were. When I looked at that choice, follow regulations and guarantee 1 death or break formation and accept the risk of 9, I realized the training was asking me to become someone I didn't want to be. Someone who could calculate a human life away because the numbers made sense. The colonel leaned back in his chair, studying Lawley with an intensity that made the young pilot uncomfortable. That's quite a philosophical position, Lieutenant. But this is the military, not a philosophy seminar. We have regulations for a reason. They're built on the accumulated experience of thousands of missions. They exist because they save lives more often than not. I understand that, sir. Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you decided your personal moral judgment was more important than the collective wisdom of the Air Force. That's a dangerous precedent. If every pilot started making decisions based on their individual conscience instead of following doctrine, we'd have chaos. The second investigator, a lieutenant colonel with navigator's wings, spoke up. Lieutenant Lawley, let me ask you this. What if you had gone down? What if the P-51s hadn't shown up? What if you'd made it partway back and had to ditch in the channel, and all 9 of you had died? Would you still think you made the right choice? It was the question Lawley had been asking himself for 3 days. The question that had kept him awake at night, replaying the mission, calculating all the ways it could have gone wrong. Sir, I don't know if I made the right choice. I just know I made the only choice I could live with. The room fell silent. The investigators exchanged glances, some unspoken communication passing between them. The colonel picked up a folder from the table, opened it, and read for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he looked up at Lawley with an expression that was impossible to interpret. Lieutenant, I'm going to tell you something that isn't in the official record yet. After your landing, we conducted a full examination of your aircraft. The damage was extensive. The engineers were frankly amazed that you kept it in the air as long as you did. They estimated you were perhaps 5 minutes from complete structural failure when you touched down. You let that sink in. What I'm saying is that the mathematical likelihood of your mission succeeding was essentially zero. You got lucky. Extraordinarily lucky. The P-51s, the emergency strip, the fact that the aircraft held together long enough. All of it was luck, not skill. Lawley didn't respond. There was nothing to say. The colonel was right. The question this board has to answer is whether the Air Force should condone that kind of luck. Whether we should tell other pilots that it's acceptable to ignore orders and regulations when they feel their conscience demands it. Because if we do, some of them are going to make similar choices and they're not going to get lucky. And then we'll have dead crews and destroyed aircraft because we told them it was okay to improvise their own rules. The third investigator, who had been silent until now, finally spoke. He was younger than the others, a major with pilot's wings and a DFC ribbon. I flew bombers over Germany, he said quietly. I've given the order to abandon aircraft. I've watched men bail out over enemy territory knowing they'd spend the rest of the war in a prisoner camp if they were lucky. I've calculated those odds dozens of times, and I've always followed the regulations because that's what you do. That's what we all do. He looked at Lawley with something that might have been sympathy or might have been disappointment. But I've never had a man trapped where he couldn't bail out. I've never had to choose between following the book and watching someone die when I could have done something. I don't know what I would have done in your position, Lieutenant. I'd like to think I would have had your courage. But I honestly don't know. The colonel closed the folder and set it aside. Lieutenant Lawley, this board will take your testimony under advisement. You'll be notified of our decision within 72 hours. Dismissed. Lawley stood, saluted, and walked out of the room with no idea what would happen next. He had told the truth. He had stood by his choice. But he had also violated direct orders and broken formation during a combat mission. In the hallway, Murphy was waiting for him along with Chen and the rest of the crew. They had been ordered to remain on base pending the inquiry results. Mason was still in the hospital, recovering from his injuries, but he had sent word through the others. Whatever happened, he wanted Lawley to know he would have made the same choice. How'd it go? Murphy asked. Lawley shook his head. I have no idea. They either think I'm a hero or a liability. Maybe both. Chen grinned, though there was tension behind it. For what it's worth, sir, we think you're a hero. All of us. We put that in our testimony. The decision came not in 72 hours but in 48. Lawley was summoned back to the gray office building, this time with his crew present. The colonel was there again along with several other senior officers Lawley didn't recognize. The colonel stood, holding a document. Lieutenant William Lawley, this board has completed its investigation into your conduct during the mission of April 16, 1945. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence, we have reached several conclusions. He paused and Lawley felt his stomach tighten. First, your decision to break formation and ignore orders was technically a violation of regulations. However, the board recognizes that regulations cannot account for every possible situation, and that the specific circumstances of Sergeant Mason's entrapment created a scenario for which standard doctrine did not provide adequate guidance. Another pause. Second, while your decision placed your crew at significant risk, the testimony makes clear that you gave them the option to bail out and every member of your crew chose to remain with the aircraft. They were not coerced. They were not following orders under duress. They made the same choice you did. The colonel's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Third, the board has concluded that while we cannot officially condone violations of orders, neither can we ignore the extraordinary initiative, courage, and devotion to crew welfare that you demonstrated. The Air Force needs pilots who will follow orders. But it also needs pilots who understand that leadership sometimes means making decisions that no regulation can guide. He looked directly at Lawley. No formal charges will be filed. You will return to active flight status immediately. And this inquiry will go into your record with a notation that while your decision was irregular, it was made in good faith under extraordinary circumstances. Lawley felt something release in his chest. Not quite relief, the weight of what he had done would stay with him regardless of official sanctions, but a validation that his choice, however unorthodox, had been understood. The colonel wasn't finished. However, Lieutenant, I want to be absolutely clear about something. You were extraordinarily fortunate. The next pilot who faces a similar choice might not have P-51 escorts appear at the right moment. They might not find an emergency landing strip. Their luck might run out long before yours did. If we could guarantee those outcomes, your choice would be easy. But we can't. And that's why regulations exist. He set the document down and looked at Lawley with something approaching respect. You made a choice that violated doctrine but honored something deeper. You put the individual above the system. That's admirable. It's also dangerous. The Air Force needs both kinds of thinking. The discipline to follow orders and the wisdom to know when orders aren't enough. Finding that balance is what separates good officers from great ones. The colonel extended his hand. Lawley shook it, feeling the weight of everything unsaid in that gesture. Dismissed. William Lawley flew 14 more combat missions before VE Day ended the European War. He brought his crew home every time, though twice more they landed with significant damage and once they made it back on 2 engines. The crew nicknamed the bomber Lucky Mason, in honor of the man whose life had started it all. Mason himself recovered fully from his injuries and returned to duty within 6 weeks. He requested assignment back to Lawley's crew, a request that was approved without comment. The ball turret had been repaired, but Mason found he couldn't bring himself to enter it again. He was quietly reassigned as a waist gunner, a position where he could reach the exit hatch if needed. No one said anything about it. They all understood. The bomber they had crash-landed was salvaged for parts. The airframe was too damaged to repair economically, but the engines, instruments and equipment were removed and redistributed to other aircraft. Lawley sometimes wondered if pieces of his bomber were still flying somewhere, carrying other crews, preserving in metal and wire the story of one April day when 9 men chose unity over survival arithmetic. After the war, Lawley returned to Pennsylvania and became a teacher. He taught high school history, not because he particularly loved history but because he wanted to work with young people at the age when they were forming their understanding of right and wrong. When students asked him about the war he told them stories, but he rarely told the story of Mason and the ball turret. It was Murphy years later at a reunion who asked him why. "Because I don't want them to think it was heroic," Lawley said quietly. "It wasn't. It was terrifying and we almost died and it only worked because we got lucky. I don't want some 18-year-old kid to think that breaking orders is noble or romantic. Rules exist for good reasons." "But you broke them anyway," Murphy pointed out. "I did. Because sometimes there's a difference between what's legal and what's right. But I was scared the whole time. I second-guessed myself for months afterward. And I would never, ever tell someone else to do what I did." Mason lived in Ohio. He married his high school sweetheart, had 3 daughters and ran a hardware store. He rarely spoke about the war but he kept a photograph on his desk. 9 young men standing in front of a B-17, their arms around each other's shoulders, their faces full of the particular confidence that comes from having faced death together and survived. He had written Lawley once, years after the war, a letter that Lawley kept in his desk drawer and sometimes read when he needed to remember why he had made the choices he had made. "Bill," the letter read, "I've spent a lot of time thinking about that day. About whether you should have left me and saved yourself and the others. About whether one life is worth risking 9. I don't have an answer. But I do know this. Every morning when I wake up next to my wife, every time I hold one of my daughters, every ordinary day I get to live, I owe it to you and the crew. You gave me a lifetime I wouldn't have had. I don't know if that was worth the risk you took. But I'm grateful beyond words that you took it anyway." The Air Force, in its official capacity, never formally changed its regulations regarding crew extraction and emergency procedures. But instructors at flight training schools began including Lawley's case in their curriculum, not as an example to follow but as a discussion point about the limitations of doctrine. "Sometimes," one instructor told his class of young pilots, "you're going to face a situation where the book doesn't have an answer. Where following procedure means accepting an outcome you can't live with. When that happens you have to make a choice. And you're going to have to live with that choice for the rest of your life, whether it works out or not. There's no training that can prepare you for that. There's only the person you are in that moment." In 1989, 44 years after that April day over the North Sea, the surviving members of the crew gathered for what would be their last reunion. Lawley was 73, his hair white, his movements slower than the young pilot who had fought to keep a damaged bomber in the air. Mason was there, walking with a slight limp that had never fully healed. Murphy, Chin and 3 others had survived the decades. 2 had died, one from cancer, one from a car accident. The last 2 could not make the trip. They spent an afternoon together, these old men who had once been young and terrified and bound together by a choice that none of them had expected to face. They told stories, remembered names, laughed at jokes that no one else would have understood. And at the end, after the others had left, Lawley and Mason stood alone beside a memorial plaque that listed the names of bomber crews from their unit who had not come home. "Do you ever regret it?" Mason asked. "The choice you made? Everything that came after?" Lawley was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 44 years of reflection. "I regret the position we were in. I regret that the war put young men in situations where there were no good choices. I regret every time I've wondered if we were just lucky and the next crew that tried something similar might not be. But do I regret keeping the crew together and bringing you home?" He shook his head slowly. "No, I don't regret that. I made a choice that could have killed us all. It almost did. But it didn't and you got to have a life. That's worth something, Henry. That's worth more than regulations or doctrine or whatever the manual said I should have done." Mason nodded, his eyes distant, seeing perhaps the interior of a ball turret, the sound of cannon fire, the moment when he heard his pilot's voice saying they weren't leaving him behind. "It's worth everything," he said softly. They stood together in silence, Two old men carrying the weight of a choice made long ago, when they had been young and scared and trying to do the right thing without any certainty about what the right thing was. The sun was setting, throwing long shadows across the memorial. In the distance, an aircraft flew overhead, its engines a distant rumble that reminded them both of another time, another sky, another moment when everything had hung in the balance. Lawley looked up at the aircraft, watching it disappear into the evening light. "We were kids," he said. "Terrified kids trying to act like we knew what we were doing. Making decisions that would affect the rest of our lives without any idea of the weight we were carrying." "But you made the right one," Mason said. Lawley smiled, but it was tinged with something complicated. "I made the one I could live with. Whether it was right? I think that's for someone else to decide. Maybe there are no right choices in war. Maybe there are only choices and the people they affect, and the question of whether you can look at yourself in the mirror afterward." Mason put a hand on his old pilot's shoulder. "You can look in that mirror, Bill. I made damn sure of it." They stood together as darkness fell, two survivors of a moment that had tested the limits of training, doctrine, and human capacity for sacrifice. Neither of them had expected to become symbols of anything. They had simply been young men trying to survive, trying to protect their own, trying to hold on to their humanity in a machine designed to strip it away. The choice William Lawley made that April day did not change regulations. It did not prevent future tragedies. It did not make war more humane or decisions easier for those who came after. But it saved one man's life. And it proved that sometimes, in the terrible arithmetic of war, the most important number is not the calculation of acceptable losses or optimal outcomes. Sometimes the most important number is simply one. One man worth saving. One crew that refused to abandon him. One choice made in the moment when doctrine failed and humanity had to answer instead. The kind of choice no training could have prepared them for. The kind of choice that defines who we are when everything else is stripped away.